Hello! This is Nosferatuesdays, where a horror writer and a scaredy cat discuss the cinematic history of Dracula.
I'm Avishai, I am the horror writer.
And I'm Michal, and I am the scaredy cat. So, Avishai, we survived our first round. And now what are we discussing today?
Well, now we exit the realm of silent film and the realm of copyright infringement and enter the realm of authorized studio talkies.
Ooh, talkies.
With what I believe is the first talkie horror feature.
Cool.
I'm pretty sure. This is me starting off a podcast saying I'm pretty sure of something.
Well, you know, we're experts. Whatever.
Oh, we know all the things. But I'm struggling to think of another horror talkie that precedes this.
Interesting. Well, we'll definitely talk about the difference between silent films and talkies as we go on, because there's some similarities with this particular film and the former medium that are actually really interesting to talk about. But, yeah, so Dracula 1931, also known as the one with Bela Lugosi, if we're going by, like, Friends titles. And, let's dive into it.
Yeah, so as we mentioned last Tuesday, Nosferatu was not authorized as an adaptation of Dracula. They made it anyway, and Bram Stoker's estate, his widow, said, nope, you can't do that. The court said, we agree. They tried to burn every copy. They failed, but that's a whole side story.
I'm so curious why they were like, burn every copy, not pay Mrs. Stoker.
I believe they started with pay Mrs. Stoker, and the response was, with what money?
Oh.
Because Nosferatu was created by a company that came into existence to make Nosferatu and hopefully other movies and just never did.
That makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, so they didn't have the money and it didn't work out, and so you got to get rid of every copy, and they just failed to do that. But that's Nosferatu. Now we have, across the ocean in America, we have Hollywood tackling Dracula, because even back at the dawn of cinema, the dawn of talkies, IP was king. Intellectual property. You got to make a movie based on something, because otherwise, you know, how can you mitigate that risk? You know.
How do you know that people are going to talk about it on, I don't know, the subway? Were there even water coolers in 1931?
The poorly ventilated underground train. Everybody's wearing three-piece suits and hats and just fanning themselves with their giant newspapers, reading about the stock market crash and wondering, when am I going to see a movie based on a book I read? But it's always been the case, even in the silent era. You know, everything was based on books. You go even back to before features, you know, when they were just making little shorts. You look at, the Thomas Edison produced Frankenstein, silent 10-minute film, roughly, just based on the novel Frankenstein, but condensed to 10 minutes and therefore really not resembling it at all. But it was Frankenstein. It's IP. You know, it's recognizable. We read a book, and we want to dramatize it, right? It goes back to theater as well. As we'll see in this case, theater plays a huge role in the development of this movie.
Mm-hmm. It definitely does. And yeah, I mean, so, sorry, Jamie, cut that out. Cut out anytime I sound like an idiot, please.
Keep every time I sound like an idiot.
I feel like I'm very out of practice.
You're good.
But, yeah, so getting into the plot of Dracula, it's actually, this is going to shock you, not that different from the plot of Nosferatu.
Yeah, it's different and it's similar, and it's funny because it's not really based on the book either, right? It's based on a play based on the book.
Right. With some significant influences from the film, from the 1922 film.
Yeah. So what happened was Universal Studios wanted to make a Dracula movie. They wanted to make one even like a decade prior to this, but it was difficult getting the rights, and there were some concerns about, you know, the horrific nature of the content. Eventually, they did manage to get the rights. That was a whole thing. Trying to convince the Stoker estate that it was worthwhile. But when they
Eat your heart out, Tolkien estate.
When they started developing the script, it was going to be based more on the book. It was going to be, you know, this sort of broad, you know, globe-trotting thing that would have been really expensive to make. And then, lo and behold, there's a stock market crash or the Great Depression, and suddenly, just financially, it doesn't make sense to do that. So what they do is they look to a popular Broadway adaptation, which they were smart enough to also buy the rights to. So if you'll look at the pedigree of who wrote this, it's based on the novel by Bram Stoker, but it's also based on the play by Hamilton Dean and John Balderston. John Balderston? I'm going to say Balderston.
Always go with bald if you can.
Always go bald. John Balderston. The play was designed to be contained because it's a play, and contained is cheap. Mm-hmm. And so what they essentially did was try to hybridize the play with certain elements of the book. Mm-hmm. And that extended to casting. They found Bela Lugosi, who will go on to be the most famous actor to play Dracula, from the Broadway show. They had checked out all sorts of other stars. They considered Conrad Veidt at one point, of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, mm-hmm. and The Man Who Laughs. There are all sorts of rumors that are kind of unsubstantiated but make a lot of sense that they would have considered Lon Chaney. Mm. The Man with 1,000 Faces, famous for, among other things, the silent Phantom of the Opera. Mm-hmm.
There's definitely a shot, I don't know if it's intentional, but there was a shot later on in this film that strikingly reminded me of Phantom of the Opera.
It would have been in the zeitgeist. And Tod Browning, the director, who was also not supposed to be the director, he came on a little bit late, he had worked with Lon Chaney several times. And so it makes sense that they would have considered Lon Chaney, but it turned out that he secretly had cancer and died. Ooh. And so it wasn't going to be Lon Chaney. But Bela Lugosi was, getting good reviews for his performance on Broadway.
And he lobbied for the role, right? He was quite interested in it.
He was very passionate about Dracula. He was, from what I've read, and I have to, give a little disclaimer that I can't necessarily verify everything that I'm reading about this movie, because when something is this old and has so many things written on it, some things kind of pass into legend. But as I understand it from what I've read, Bela Lugosi wasn't just passionate about playing Dracula, he was instrumental in getting the rights. Mm. He talked to I'm going to stop saying widow. I want to know what his wife's name was.
The widow Stoker.
He talked to Florence Stoker, Bram Stoker's widow, and legend has it his enthusiasm was instrumental in convincing her to sell the rights. He also took a massive pay cut to do it. Mm-hmm. He was not paid very much at all. Yeah. You adjust for inflation, it's decent, but even now by today's standards, it's pretty low for an actor. Mm-hmm. Honestly, the highest paid actor on this movie is the one who plays Mina.
Interesting.
Who Tod Browning had lobbied for because he saw her in a show and thought, she'd be good.
Yeah, she is very good.
But Bela Lugosi was the one who cared the most. And, he wasn't the only stage actor from the Dracula show that they brought over. They brought Edward Van Sloan, who plays Van Helsing. Mm. And the actor who played Renfield on stage really wanted to do it, but they gave it to Dwight Frye instead. Ah. But if you look at the photos, they are very similar. Yeah, but it was an interesting production. It was cheap. If you adjust for inflation, the movie costs $6.5 million in today's terms.
Wow.
The studio was not doing super great, but they took a chance on this. And by they, I mean Carl Laemmle Jr. Mm. So he's the son of Carl Laemmle,
yes.
Mr. Universal. Super young when he took over, mm-hmm. Early 20s. He saw something in the horror canon and said, let's make this horror picture. To which some people were skeptical, but, again, they had been pursuing the rights for a while. Mm-hmm. And long story short, it saved the company.
Which is so funny from a modern perspective, because the Monsterverse has been something that almost notoriously Universal has been trying to resurrect for quite a long time at this point. I think we all remember the famous Comic-Con spread with Tom Cruise and
Dark Universe.
Yeah.
Did I tell you I did a general meeting there?
No.
Back in 2017, I had written a werewolf script, and I got a meeting at Dark Universe. This was right before the Mummy remake came out. And so I'm out at Universal Studios. They have their own offices, and I'm sitting in the waiting room, and it's fully a Frankenstein lab with a big diorama and a big tall Frankenstein. And I'm waiting, and the assistant at the desk says, "Hey, you should pull that lever." So I pull the lever on the wall. That's like the big Frankenstein lab lever. It's just flashing lightning.
Oh my God.
You can hear, "It's alive! It's alive!" And they had such plans for their Marvel-esque shared universe, and then The Mummy came out and was not what they hoped.
Yeah,
and
not so much.
I heard some of those plans. There was some fun stuff.
Yeah.
But I read an article later on saying that that office was left derelict on the lot.
Oh,
with
no!
a big diorama of Frankenstein gathering dust. I'm like, oh, I was there. Dark Universe.
The Wolf, I can't believe I'm referencing the Wolfman in 2 episodes, but the Wolfman is part of that, technically, I think, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the idea that they originally had, this is such a digression, but the idea that they were considering at the time when they were going to go for these big, like, $100 million, like, superhero-esque, shared universe thing, they wanted to have Dwayne Johnson as the Wolfman, as a werewolf who can control his changes, and he'd be fighting werewolves who couldn't. And it was going to basically just be a werewolf.
That seems a little unfair of him.
A little unfair of him.
Also kind of a Blade ripoff, if I'm being honest.
Well, their vision at the time was superhero-y, right? I mean, their Bride of Frankenstein was going to involve the Frankenstein family turning into a large corporation that was going to be at war with the Jekyll organization.
That kind of rocks.
There was some cool stuff in there that we'll never see, but they wisely pivoted back to smaller movies. But, like, talking about smaller movies, this was a small movie. The horror movies were not done at the time in Hollywood. People didn't have an appetite for it, or at least people didn't think they had an appetite for it. Especially, the beginning of the Depression, people wanted escapism. And the idea of a movie about a bad man who does bad things, just not super wholesome. And yet, turned out to be exactly what American audiences were looking for.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe if they had known that, they might have invested a little bit more money in it. But it's, what we have is essentially a film stage play with some interesting. There's definitely some cinematic shots to it, but it's a very contained affair.
Well, speaking of cinematic shots, and actually going from like the idea of translating a stage play to the screen, it feels to me like that was maybe not something that was a concern of the other version of this film, which was shot simultaneously, and I don't know, which was shot simultaneously and is in Spanish.
Yeah, there was a practice at the time that was eventually discontinued. And by eventually, I mean like immediately after this movie.
It's kind of a shame. I actually think it's a cool idea.
It's super cool. Of like, sound was new. Sound was new. The concept of dubbing hadn't taken hold yet. The concept of subtitles certainly hadn't taken hold yet. If you want to sell a movie in another territory, why not just re-record the film in that language?
Which, of course, previously you could very easily do by just changing the intertitles to the language of the location.
Exactly. And so here there was a sense that, South American countries, Latin American countries would have a large market, for films. And so why not shoot Dracula during the day and Dracula at night? The different director and a different cast, but on the same sets. Same script. Same script.
Different character names.
Slightly different character names. And it's so funny to compare the two movies because the director of the Spanish version was privy to the dailies of Tod Browning's English language version. And so he knew what they had shot, and he would try to sort of one-up it. And there's a lot of really cool visual flourishes in it. There's scenes in it that aren't in the English language version because they were cut out of the English language version. There's dialogue that was changed. And in a lot of ways, a lot of film scholars look back at the Spanish version. The consensus seems to be that it's the better movie, with the exception of the actor who plays Dracula, who just isn't Bela Lugosi.
There are a couple of scenes, and I think we should link this. There was a fascinating YouTube video comparing the two versions, and we can link that in the show notes. But like, what they showed was really striking in certain areas. Like, I mean, down to like costuming. The costumes of the American version had to be a lot more reserved for the female characters, whereas the Spanish language were I mean, by our standards today, not revealing, but, more like if someone's going to bed, they're in more of a negligee than they are like a sleeping ball gown.
Yeah, no, there's definitely something to be said for comparing the cultural mores in the films. Yeah, no, it's they have such different dynamisms to them. They have such different dynamics to them, I guess. Different energies, but the same sets and in a lot of the same costumes, but like different in places that really kind of you can tell. Like you were talking about, like the nightwear is different. The performance styles are different. The actors were not supposed to look at the dailies, so they didn't know how their counterparts performed it. So you have this great moment in the English version where Renfield is asked about Dracula and does this really campy, over the top, like, Dracula? I have never even heard the name. And
to be fair, campy and over the top is this entire performance.
Oh, and he knew what he was doing.
Yes, definitely.
And then you look at the Spanish language version, and it's like, Dracula? I've never heard of him. And it's such. I'm always obsessed with seeing how different directors tackle the same material.
Yeah, I mean, my favorite is a scene quite close to the end of the movie where Dracula is telepathically communicating with Mina, and the American version doesn't make sense. Like, it's a wide shot, and she could be talking to Parker, who's also in the scene with her. She could be talking to anybody. She's just kind of staring into the distance. And they use a close-up in the Spanish version, and it is instantly, like, I guess just the language of film familiar, and I can understand what she's doing.
Yeah, from a film school standpoint, it's fascinating to compare how they are different and how one works when the other doesn't in certain instances. And then in the Spanish version, sometimes they'll break the 180-degree rule in a cut, where suddenly characters will just be facing another direction in a cut, and it's just jarring. And it's like, yeah, they are inventing the film language even still in 1931.
Yeah. One more technical thing I want to talk about before we do actually talk about the plot. You mentioned that sound was an issue, and obviously we've talked about how this is a quote unquote talkie. But you mentioned while we were watching it that some of the blocking in the scenes is particularly awkward because characters have to be placed in such a way that the mics can hear them.
Yeah, so there are a whole bunch of interesting points of comparison and contrast to Nosferatu with this movie, and one of them is how the switch to talkies changes just the whole art form and the style of shooting. And by the way, the cinematographer on this, Karl Freund, he is famous for shooting Fritz Lang's Metropolis in Germany. So it's not even necessarily an America-Germany thing. But when you're shooting a silent film in the silent era, you're going for what is the most visually striking thing you could shoot. You're going for what gets the emotion across, what is the image. So we're going from that to sound, where suddenly there are different considerations and information is paramount. And so suddenly you have shots that aren't composed necessarily for striking imagery. You're composing them so that you have actors in the frame who can deliver their dialogue. Suddenly you have big silences that you ironically didn't have before, because in the silent era, films were never silent. There was always somebody playing music. But suddenly with sound, there was an idea of, well, do you even need music anymore? Because it's no longer actually silent. You're not filling the noise. And in fact, maybe it'll be confusing to people if you're listening to the sound, but there's a sound there that's not actually coming from anything. Like, would that be confusing? So, which is something that people said about the close-up before close-ups were instead
of like, it didn't have the word diegetic.
Back in the silent era, before the invention of the close-up, there was a sense of, but if we don't see the entire thing, it'll be confusing because it's like you're cutting off their head. And but you have so suddenly you have these awkward silences, and yeah, you're blocking around the placement of microphones too. Microphones are a new and delicate art, new and delicate technology, and you want to make sure that you're not missing the sound, that you're not blowing out the sound. So there's hidden microphones in certain places. They didn't quite have lavalier mics at the time. I'm not 100% sure if they quite had boom mics yet. They might have had like mics that were kind of built into the sets at this point. I'll have to look into this. I know that there was a switch over at one point, but you have people standing a lot closer together and not quite moving around in quite dynamic ways while they're talking. They kind of hit their marks and have to say their lines at their marks. And it's really interesting going from Nosferatu to this and seeing what was a visual medium turn into a semi-visual, essentially recording of performances.
Yeah. And that, brings us around to the fact that there is no score or soundtrack. Well, obviously no soundtrack, but no score to this movie. Like, the overriding sound you hear is like, I guess it would be the microphone hiss?
Yeah, well, okay, so you have a little bit of music in the opening credits. You have, which is Swan Lake.
Right.
Very classically, Dracula is Swan Lake. And then you have a little bit of music when they're at the opera, because there's literally music there, and a little bit of tiny music at the end, which is just kind of like church bells, and it kind of turns into like a little, that's just sort of it. But for the most part, you have silence, and you have a hiss on the recording, which, it does kind of have to be applied to it, or it's a byproduct of the entire thing, because if you think about it, they're cutting together snippets of sound, and there's no real variation in that hiss, which makes me think that it wasn't necessarily recorded on set. I'll have to look into that.
Oh, interesting.
I know that the namesake of the term Foley artist, Foley, I'm going to say Jack Foley, I'm going to look it up real quick. Yes. The namesake of Foley artist, Jack Foley, did the sound design for this movie.
No way! That's crazy.
Isn't that fun? So you have all sorts of post-recorded sounds, footsteps, skittering of armadillos. We'll get to that. But like little things like that. So it's not quite like they left the sound.
Bat puppet making some
noises. Little screech, 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 the sound of the waves when they're at sea. It's not a movie devoid of sound design at all. Sound design's still new, but it's pretty smoothly integrated. It's just that it also has these awkward silences, which sometimes it's eerie and sometimes it's just a little lifeless.
Yeah. There is apparently a version of the score created by Philip Glass, and there are versions you can find online where certain scenes are played like, here's without the score and here's with the score, and it was so almost bizarre to me because as I was watching, I was like kind of on my phone during the soundless ones and like, okay, this is kind of boring, like whatever. And then I immediately like looked up and started paying attention, even though the exact same things were happening when the score kicked in.
Yeah, Philip Glass was hired in 1998 by Universal Studios to compose a score, and he didn't go for a horror-y score. He went for a very sort of classical, old school, 30s-ish kind of score, and it's kind of beautiful. It's kind of great, and it really changes the vibe of the whole thing.
Yeah, it's really it's almost like sleepy a lot of the time. It's very lovely.
Yeah, it's very dreamlike. It's elegiac. It's not horror.
Okay, so that's kind of the background portion, and let's get into the plot and the experience, I guess, of watching Dracula.
Yeah, let's get into it. So we start off with Renfield.
Before that, we actually start off with kind of a humorous scene. There's a bunch of tourists in a carriage, and there's a woman reading about the Carpathian Mountains in a very high-pitched voice.
Fun fact, Carla Laemmle.
Oh.
Relative of Carl Laemmle, I believe his niece. And she is the first woman to have an opening speaking role in an American horror movie.
A lot of firsts in this film.
She was very proud of this fact.
Listen, Nepo baby, but still.
Listen, Hollywood in the 30s, it's all Nepo babies all the way down. Carl Laemmle Jr. looked like a baby at the time, like fully a child. But yeah, no, we're in a carriage in Transylvania with some tourists, and there we meet Renfield, the real estate agent, who in the novel would have been at this point Harker, and in Nosferatu would have been Hutter. Mm-hmm. And here, like the stage play I believe it's based on, they decide to make this Renfield. Mm-hmm.
Which, we can discuss this a little bit more later, but creates a very strong dividing line between the heroes and the villains of the movie.
Yeah, no, it's really striking. Renfield in this movie is probably the most compelling character. Mm-hmm. He is played by Dwight Frye, very famously. Very flamboyant actor, would always be typecast after this as the weirdo. But he starts off this movie as a regular real estate guy who's going off to Transylvania, and as he tells the locals at the local inn, or I guess it's kind of played like a bus stop a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
He's like, I'm going off to Dracula's castle, and then we get that scene that we get in all of these movies.
Yes, folks,
like,
it's time to play Do They Listen to the Locals? And the answer is still no.
Yeah, no, we have a wonderful local with a big mustache saying, you don't want to go out there. There's a Dracula out there.
And also, it's Walpurgis Night, which...
Oh, yeah, Walpurgis Night.
Yeah.
What do you know about Walpurgis Night? Because that is that has some history.
Is that Halloween? It sounds extremely familiar.
Traditional... I'm going to not read off AI. An abbreviation of Saint Walpurgis Night. It's in April. It's the eve of the Christian feast day of Saint Walpurga, an 8th century abbess, I guess a female superior of nuns.
Yes.
Yeah, and I guess in Transylvania, in this universe, that's also when creepy shit happens. I'm looking at the Wikipedia right now. Saint Walpurga was hailed by the Christians of Germany for battling pest, rabies, and whooping cough, as well as against witchcraft.
So it's interesting that on her night, those things would come out, I guess?
Yeah.
All right.
You don't go to Borgo Pass on Walpurgis Night.
Yeah, definitely not.
Not when Mustache Man tells you not to.
Except you do.
Except you do.
And there's something also in this scene that I think is really important to track, which is there's a lot of crossing. There are like immediate like references to Christianity. Where Nosferatu 1922 was a little more bland on that. Not bland, but you know, a little bit less...
a little more ambiguous.
Yes, ambiguous. That was the word I was looking for. On the religious score, this movie comes like right out from the top, and there was an almost immediate dichotomy between the forces of Christianity and the forces of Dracula.
Yeah, in Nosferatu, I think the closest thing we get to overt Christianity as just as a representative of Christianity is the nun who helps Hutter. Mm-hmm. But aside from that, it seems more like a battle between virtue and plague.
Yes.
Right? It's good and evil. There's pure and there's impure.
Mm-hmm.
And here we have a sense of, the good and evil is God and Satan, right? Mm-hmm. It's Christianity, and it's I guess sort of like a form of paganism, but it's sort of like a Christian-defined paganism. Yeah,
well, I mean, I guess I don't want to look too deeply into this, but I'm assuming that Transylvanian local Christianity would still be heavily Catholicized, and obviously in the main part of the story takes place in England, and that's obviously a Protestant Anglican country. So, well, I mean, obviously it's Anglican because it's English, but but one of the differences between Protestantism and Catholicism is the elimination of saints. Right.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting, and it's also interesting that this is a movie made in America in the 30s, right? This is, this and Nosferatu are both after World War I, but this is the other side of the war,
right?
And we're going into a severe depression, and it is interesting, and it makes sense that there would be a sort of a reach for divine authority, mm-hmm. right?
I mean, something that Van Helsing will say later on, who is also an interesting character to think about in this context, but he explicitly says the strength of the vampire is that people will not believe in him, which is like the greatest trick the devil ever pulled, etc.
Oh yeah, and we'll fully get into that and Van Helsing as an authority figure.
Yeah,
because there's a lot to say there.
Yeah,
but yeah, so Renfield does not listen to the locals, which he should have, because I'm sure at this point he's seen Nosferatu, but I guess not.
Yeah,
and he doesn't even stay the night. He just fully gets back on a cart.
If he'd stayed the night, he would have gotten the book.
Yeah, he didn't. He doesn't get a book in this. He gets a cross.
He gets a cross.
But he doesn't get a book. And he hits the road, goes to Borgo Pass. The driver takes him to a random spot, drops him off.
And then just, books it. It's really funny. Yeah. He, dumps him out of the carriage and is just like, bye-bye.
I don't even know if he got paid.
Yeah. It's Walpurgis Night. It's fine.
Yeah. And Renfield is just sort of he's kind of a happy idiot. He's kind of like Hutter in that same sort of way of he's just sort of like, oh, that's weird.
Yeah.
And then another horse carriage comes by with a a driver who, much like Nosferatu, is very clearly, like, this is Dracula.
Yes.
Except unlike in Nosferatu, we can just fully see his face. Right? He has like this hood on that kind of covers the sides of his face, but his forehead down to his chin is just fully visible, and he's staring with his unmistakable Bela Lugosi eyes. And I guess Renfield just doesn't pay attention. He gets on, and the cart starts going a little fast, and he looks out the window and.
Well, I mean, that's also interesting because I know we discussed last episode that the design of Nosferatu in that film is kind of an interesting hybrid of relatable human and otherworldly, but I feel like Renfield could be forgiven a little bit more than Hutter as far as like mistaking their carriage driver for a human being. Because Bela Lugosi is not wearing any prosthetics. He obviously, his eyes are incredibly striking and recognizable, like from any angle, really. His eyes are awesome. but I guess if I were there, I'd be like, all right, dude is picking me up, not what's that picking me up.
Yeah, and it's a dramatic image too when we see the driver's face, like the way it's shot. Like, Karl Freund gets a lot of credit there, but it's also funny comparing the two movies of like, we're doing the shift into supernatural. Mm-hmm. How in Nosferatu, the way they sort of define that is the place is supernatural. Like, we have now crossed over into the land of hyena werewolves, and now like this evil carriage shows up, but it shows up like kind of sped up and a little stop motion-y, and like everything's just a little weird and off. Whereas here, the sign that things are supernatural is that when the carriage is going a little fast and bumpy, and Renfield pokes out his head to complain,
"Say, driver!" There's
no driver there. There's a bat. There's a bat flying over the horses, and it's a fun little rubber bat. Technology.
I wonder if that prop still exists somewhere.
There's no way.
No, probably not.
That rubber has melted. But it's I'm trying to cast my mind back into the mind of somebody who would have seen this in the 30s. Do they know what a rubber bat looks like at that point? Like, how permissive are they? Because you look at it now and you're like, that's a rubber bat on a fishing line, and somebody's like bobbing it up and down, and it looks silly as hell. But like, in context, I don't know what the technology was. Like, they weren't going to animate a bat. They were going to have, especially not with the budget that they have. But yeah, they have horses and they have a rubber bat.
Yep.
Real horses.
Real horses, fake bats.
Oh, and by the way, should point out a lot of really nice matte paintings in this. Because, Tod Browning, as a director, really liked static shots. Karl Freund did not. Karl Freund loved moving shots. If you watch Metropolis, which is one of the most visually striking movies ever made, even today, he loves a moving shot. Tod Browning...
No relation to Megalopolis.
No relationship to Megalopolis. Oh, my God. Oh, man. We got to show you Metropolis. It's sci-fi, not horror.
Oh, okay.
I think you can handle it.
Yeah.
There's a robot lady. We'll talk.
Yeah.
but Karl Freund wants to do moving shots. Tod Browning doesn't. And as a result, you have these static shots that allow for matte paintings, which is, these hyper-realistic paintings on glass that you can actually have in front of the lens to expand the set or the location. And so the opening shot that has the carriage coming down the pass, and you have the mountains. The mountains are painting. Mm-hmm. When we are on the pass, and when we see the castle up ahead, the castle is a painting. And then when we are in Dracula's castle, and we have a beautiful wide shot with this sort of like crumbling cathedral, a lot of that is painting.
Fascinating. That's this has started to make me kind of consider a little bit of what we've lost in like the increase in quality, because nowadays we see something in CGI and no matter how good it looks, we're like, well, that's CGI. But, we were talking about ironically, the poor quality of the film of Nosferatu making the character design really much more intimidating at the time and if you watch an original, I guess, cut of it. Matte paintings are obviously still used today. The Lord of the Rings. I'm pretty sure there was a whole segment on the behind the scenes DVD about their matte paintings, but it's much less distinguishable when everything is in black and white.
Yeah, and I love a good matte painting because part of it is if you can't move your camera very much, like maybe you can do a little bit of like a tilt and pan with it, but you're not going to do that CGI thing where you can actually just fly through the landscape, which means you have to know what your shot is. You're designing for an image. And that's why those are some of the most striking shots in the whole movie, which has a lot of standing still and talking scenes in parlors. But when you have striking shots, they're really striking. And so many of those are ones that are, you know, that are attenuated by matte paintings.
I mean, they also don't need dialogue, so they didn't have to worry about people standing around and talking.
This is also true. The really wide shots tend to be they'll have dialogue in some of them, and honestly, I love a good wide shot in a horror movie. There's this idea that there's this idea that horror lives in the wide. You know, if you don't get enough detail, you're not super close up to the thing, but you can kind of see this thing in the distance, you can get a lot of creepy mileage out of that. And there are some wonderful wide shots in this, including some dialogue scenes later on, you know, with like Renfield on the stairs, which we'll get to, which I feel play stronger than if they were shot kind of in a contemporary, like in a modern way, where you'll do kind of shot reverse shot of close-ups and maybe a two shot and maybe a wide when necessary, and because then you're in a movie, and there's something just about the image, you know, just a good striking image. This movie is beautifully lit. I love the contrast in this. I love the lighting in this. I don't love the movie. This is a little bit of a spoiler for the podcast, but we'll get to that. But anyway, we're in his house now.
Yes, we are in Dracula's house, and it's crazy. It's like a decrepit castle. Like it looks incredible. It really does. There's a massive spider web, like the spider web the size of, like, I don't know. I was gonna say like a door frame, but it's bigger than that. It's like a cathedral window, basically.
It's larger than a person. I mean, there's a moment where, you know, at the end of the scene where Dracula leaves, where he's walking towards the spiderweb, and we cut away and we cut back and he's behind it. Yeah. But there's no way he could have gotten there through natural means. But we finally meet Dracula, and it's the very classic Bela Lugosi introduction. Like, obviously we've seen him already in this movie, but this is his real introduction. He's in the costume. It's full shot of him with the cape and his elegance
and a candle.
He's holding the candle, and it's like, I am Dracula. I bid you welcome. Like, it's so classic.
There's so many things that have like entered the chat basically with this movie. You know, like the costume, the cape. You know, no buttons in sight really. I mean, I guess on his waistcoat a little bit, but definitely nothing like Nosferatu's like incredible button game. You know, the accent, that is so iconic, like completely indivisible from what we think of as Dracula, and that's all new to this film. Or I guess it was in the stage play, but
yeah, and that's Bela Lugosi. You know, he's a Hungarian actor, and he is fully in his accent, and it goes a very long way. There are rumors, kind of hard to substantiate, that when he was on stage, he learned his lines phonetically because he didn't know English at the time. A little tricky to parse if that's true or not, or if it's legend. He certainly knew English by the time he made this movie.
Yes.
But
he had to talk to Mrs. Stoker.
By the way, side note, because he was so committed and he was trying to do this method thing where he would psych himself up into the role, he would go around set kind of saying, I am Dracula. I am Dracula. Like, he would go around doing that. And there was a rumor for a long time that spread by some of the other actors, because he was a little standoffish, that like, oh, he's delusional. He thinks he's really Dracula. And his family had to come out and say, no. No, he
was just trying to be a good actor, guys.
Weird guy, but he's not. But he doesn't have dementia. Like, he knows he's not Dracula.
Although, we should say, he was buried in the cape.
Yeah, well, he was buried in...
Okay, a cape. But it was a Dracula cape.
This is true. His family picked that out.
And this is not a Hungarian tradition.
Yeah, and it's not something that he wanted to do either. That was something his family, decided to do. And they eventually sold the real cape.
I do actually have this image of, like, in, I don't know, 500 years, somebody, like, unearthing Bela Lugosi's grave and being like, hey, we knew it, they were real.
Put a stake to the chest, just be careful. But I want to compare real quick this introduction to Nosferatu.
Okay.
Because we have the castle, we have the vampire, we have the real estate agent. Mm-hmm. And the castle.
It's so funny, I'm sorry. The very cool castle, the very scary vampire, and the real estate agent. Have
you noticed that every single time this goes down, it all starts off with a real estate lawyer?
Yeah.
They cause problems, man. I'm saying this as a son of one. They're going around inviting Draculas, but it's interesting because you have the scene here, and for one thing, the set of the castle in Nosferatu, I believe they shot in an actual castle, and it feels a little bit more real.
It does.
And there's something really kind of creepy about it, because it feels real, but it feels remote, and it feels like it's sort of naturally old. And here, this is a set with some extensions, and it's fully gothic. Like, there's spider webs, there's the gigantic, stained glass windows that are cracked, the big old staircase that goes to nowhere.
It's grand and decrepit.
It's grand, decrepit. Nobody's cleaned up in like 500 years. And then in Nosferatu, the guy who shows up is this creepy, strange man, who's wearing this bizarre button outfit, and he's got his big hat in his ears, and like he feels sort of generically foreign, right, in a sort of exotic way. Bela Lugosi shows up, and he's dressed to the nines.
Yes.
And he is clean, and his hair's slicked back, and he is social as hell. He is not the antisocial Orlok who is just kind of bizarre to be around and doesn't know how to be around people. This guy has been waiting and practicing and rehearsing his lines in the mirror. But not in the mirror.
Renfield is charmed. Well, Renfield is charmed by him. You can see that.
Yeah, Dracula shows up after, like, Renfield walks in this castle. He's a little creeped out and a little unnerved. Then Dracula shows up and says, "I am Dracula." And Renfield's like, "Oh, thank fuck."
Yeah. This super weird thing happened where, like, my coachman disappeared.
My baggage is gone. Oh, I got your baggage. Oh, I'm not going to question that. But Bela Lugosi's Dracula, there's a reason this movie is immortal, and it really comes down to Bela Lugosi, because there are other elements of this movie that I think are questionable. And a lot of it doesn't come from the book, including the look of Dracula. It does not resemble the book.
Yeah, he's more handsome than he's described in the book.
Yeah, in the book, he's off-putting, and he has and this is, I have not, full disclosure, I have not read the book. I have read...
Full disclosure, I have acquired a copy of the book, and we'll be reading it.
We're going to talk about that once you do. But I've read summaries, and I've from different sources and whatnot, and comparisons and whatnot. So I feel like I can talk a little bit about this. But Bela Lugosi's look is fully new, and it will define the character forever, and it will come back to Nosferatu a bit in time.
It's the Grandpa Monster costume, like 100%, down to the metal. It's incredible.
Yeah, and this is before it's so well recognized that it's like Homer Simpson, right?
Yeah.
Because it is funny watching this movie and having people say like, "Oh, have you heard this? Count Dracula's in town. Oh, Count Dracula's in town. By the way, there are these murders. I wonder who's doing these murders. Oh, have you said hi to Count Dracula?" Yeah. And like, they don't know, but we know it. It's very funny.
That's an interesting meta thing and an intertextual thing that, like, so many of these things have inherent meaning to us that they don't at the time of the film coming out, and they don't within the context of the film.
Yeah, it feels like you're being told, like, "Hey, we're having a rash of destroyed buildings. By the way, have you met this Godzilla fellow? Yeah, right. He's in town." But, it's all being invented on the spot. And Lugosi is just so charismatic.
Yeah.
In this role. His eyes, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
They literally give him hypnotism powers. And it's on the eyes and it's on the wrist.
Yep.
And it's on the cape, which, by the way, the underside of that cape in real life was not red because it wouldn't have shown up in black and white film, contrasting with the black. So it's actually kind of a light tan.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, fun fact.
Good to know. Can we get to the gay stuff now?
So Dracula has wives.
Well, okay, so we have the same scene where he signs the papers and Renfield cuts his finger. I think it looks like a paper cut, but he says it's from the paper clip, and of course Dracula gets like extremely interested.
Yeah, "I don't drink wine."
Yeah, he serves Renfield wine.
Which, by the way, that line became so popular that in subsequent Broadway performances, they had to add that line into the show because it wasn't in it, because people were expecting it.
Intertextuality, folks.
Yeah, but there's definitely more of a homosexual charge with a man dressed and acting like Bela Lugosi as the Dracula, who's, taking care of Renfield. Like, "Here's your food, here's your drink, and I'm going to sign your papers, and ooh, the blood of your finger, and ooh, do you hear the children of the night? Yeah. Oh, what music they make." There's something kind of flirtatious about it.
It is, and then there's a really interesting, the next thing that happens is that Dracula leaves. Renfield is like, all right, cool. I'm going to go open these like big crazy ass windows. And while he's distracted doing that, the three brides, brides? I don't know. Yeah. Women of Dracula come floating inside, and they're all very creepy. They're all very contoured, and, they kind of approach him. He faints, and then we see a bat coming in through the window, the open windows, which I think I don't know, maybe they have very similar windows in the set for the institution, so I don't know if that's like the same set, but
it's I'm pretty sure they're different sets, but they're the same set designer.
Yeah. Anyway, less interesting part. The more interesting part is Dracula materializes, and he moves his brides away, and then approaches Renfield, who is unconscious on the floor, and sweeps his cape as he like descends to bite him. And then we fade to black. But it is like really charged if you look at it in a certain way.
Yeah, and that was not lost on the producers.
I love this now.
Yeah. So fun fact about the studio at the time, or about studio films at the time. Directors did not make movies, studios made movies. Mm-hmm. Producers made movies. This was a Carl Laemmle movie, not a Tod Browning movie. And so there were a lot of mandates from the top. And one of those mandates was Dracula can only kill women. He cannot kill men because that's too gay. This is an actual note. And the scene was supposed to be the brides were going to be the ones to drink Renfield's blood and turn him into the weirdo he becomes. But Tod Browning thought it should be Dracula. And frankly, he was right.
Totally right.
And just side note, I think part of what makes Lugosi's performance so great is when he's not talking. Because he's obviously famous for his lines, but when he's actually going about the business of being a Dracula,
yeah,
when he's not like having to be social, when he's actually just being a killer, he is a silent man, but he knows what he's doing and he's very in charge. And here he comes in and his wives back up out of fear.
Yeah.
And it's very, he doesn't have to say a word. It's just like, this man is mine.
Yeah.
And it's so cool.
It's a really cool scene.
And by the way, the brides are really fun because they're so dressed up. They're all very clean. Their hair is great. They arise out of their coffins off screen because they didn't quite know how to elegantly show somebody getting out of a coffin. So they would always pan away and then come back to they're already out, which is a cool image because it's sort of like, oh, I looked away for a secend and there they are. Like that does make them a little creepier.
I like to imagine that rehearsal. Where this isn't working.
Yeah, it was a Texas switch. If you don't know, a Texas switch is when you have a stunt person doing something and then in the same shot you transition to the real actor kind of seamlessly, because like the stunt person dives behind a table and then the actor arises after. So there's somebody in that coffin and you pan away and then it's like, and cue brides, and you come back and the brides are there. But they're great. They never say anything. And it's not quite clear what their deal is.
No, they don't return.
They don't return. Dracula abandons it. By the way, random side note, why is there a coffin for a bug?
I don't know, man.
We see this great montage of the coffins opening up, which I guess is the actual...
And an armadillo, right? That's where the armadillo comes in.
Yeah, there's armadillos. It
falls off. It's like crawling on something.
No, that's the possum.
Oh, the possum. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, the opossum.
Sorry, between the hyenas and the...
A lot of critters in this. By the way, this is the actual introduction of Dracula. We actually see him the first time in this scene, but it's like these coffins opening up kind of off screen, and we come back and there are the brides and there's Dracula standing there staring straight into the camera with his command. But like there's a little insert of a tiny little coffin with a bug coming out of it. And I don't know what the deal is with that, but I appreciate the conscientiousness of that bug should get its own bed.
It's a vamp beetle.
By the way, the armadillos, there's a story behind it.
Oh my goodness, of course there are.
There was a legend of armadillos, because they'd be sighted in graveyards, that maybe they dig their way into coffins and eat bodies. Turns out that's utter bullshit. But it was a thing at the time. And
Nobody bothered to ask the armadillo.
Nobody bothered to ask the armadillo. But that's the most likely reason why there are armadillos in the English version of this movie, not in the Spanish version, because in the Spanish version, armadillos are just a lot more commonplace.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. But there is a poor opossum, and for some of these B-roll shots where you don't have the actors doing dialogue, they would take the alternate shots for the Spanish version. In the alternate shot, the possum falls. Drunk possum. But yeah, so Renfield is now Draculized.
Yeah.
And now we're on a boat.
Yeah. No, but just to go back for a split second, you're completely right that it would not have worked if we had seen the brides attack Renfield. I mean, first of all, just the connection that is so important between Dracula and Renfield, but also we need to know what Dracula does. And while we don't see anything explicitly, we can see less and less of it as the film goes on, because we already have a basis in understanding kind of the mechanisms of how he takes over people.
And it also puts him in a position of power, right? Like, this is how we know, like, not only is he a vampire, because we know, they've said the word vampire at this point, we're seeing him getting out of a coffin and whatnot, but Nosferatu's Orlok is a guy who hides.
Yeah.
Right? He's vermin, right? Mm-hmm. Dracula is front and center.
A gentleman.
He is a socialite, and also he has a certain nobility to him. And this scene demonstrates he's not just a killer. He's a guy who takes what's his, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's a very dominating thing. Mm-hmm. Also, there's something kind of, oh, poor baby. There's something kind of fascinating too, that it's specifically exerting power over women, which I feel like is a thing that comes up a lot in this movie. Yes, I think
we definitely need to come back to that. We have a lot to discuss. But yeah, so we're on a boat.
We're on a boat.
And it's not called the Demeter, actually, even though everything else pretty much from the book is taken. It's called the Vestra.
The Vesta, yeah.
Vesta.
And this...
Not Vespa, Vesta.
Vesta. With a T. And we get a nice little intertitle, a little leftover thing from the silent era of Aboard the Vesta, It's, and we suddenly see, we're underneath the deck, and there's Renfield already... Classically Renfield. This is the Renfield that's going to make such a lasting impact on the future of all of Draculadom.
It's a very striking change also, because Renfield is really quite put together previously, and now he's like, his hair's all messed up, his eyes are bugging out, he's like, master.
Yeah, he's a sycophant who'll do anything that Dracula wants, so long as he gets paid in return with bugs. Mm-hmm. He wants lives, but little lives, not big ones. He just wants bugs. He wants to eat flies and spiders, and Dracula doesn't talk to this man.
No.
At this point on, the pleasantries are done. Dracula is just sort of staring him down as know your place.
Yeah.
Fun fact: the shots above board on the ship, when we're seeing the waves splashing around and the storm. That's taken from a silent film.
Oh, interesting.
I believe called The Stormbreakers. And that's why it moves at a different frame rate. And we're moving around so fast.
It does look very different, actually.
Shout out to Jack Foley for the great sound design of The Storm. But it's fully stock footage because they couldn't afford to do this back then. This is the Depression. This is a studio that's sort of considered second rate at the time and is on the verge of dying. And you need some shots of a boat, we can get some interior set stuff where nothing's splashing around, but you want the water. We gotta steal that.
That probably explains why there's no loading the ship, moving out with the coffins, all that. And
by the way, I know that we're probably not demonstrating this very well with our timing, but we are not far into this movie at all.
We are really not.
That's a big difference from Nosferatu too, right?
Yes.
Nosferatu, it takes a while before we get on that boat and we're traveling to...
Well, he has to write letters to his wife about all the mosquito bites he has.
That's true. But it's funny how in Nosferatu, the bulk of the movie is Hutter in Orlok's castle. And here in Dracula, that's all prologue.
Yeah. It's Dracula in London that's really the interesting part.
We haven't met our protagonist yet.
We have not, but we're about to.
Who do you think the protagonist is?
Oh, that's so interesting. Jesus?
Jesus H. Christ!
I would say it's probably Van Helsing.
I agree. And I think that's a new thing. I think tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure the book, it's about Jonathan and Mina, right?
Yes. I think Mina is the heroine. I'm sure a lot of English majors are yelling at me right now, but I seem to remember her being, at least when I read the book in college, much more prominent than I thought she would be.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Nosferatu, and Thomas Hutter is our guy until he's essentially useless, and then it becomes all of Ellen's, you know, like she's the one who takes matters into her own hands, and the Van Helsing character is completely off to the sidelines. Here, Harker, the Hutter analog, is not, like, he's not the protagonist, and also he's diminished from the book because he doesn't even go to the castle. Like, he's really supporting. Mina is changed in this to be the daughter of Dr. Seward, who runs a sanatorium. Sanatorium, thank you. And that sanatorium is relevant.
Because it's the main location for the rest of the movie. But before that, Dracula arrives in London, and we get probably my favorite shots, which are him like walking around the misty London night. I don't know if there's a year that this is particularly set in, but this set of scenes like jumped out at me as kind of, I don't know if it was intentional, but a reference to Jack the Ripper.
It's very Jack. For your favorite shot, I thought you were going to say the captain tied to the wheel, the shadow.
It's a little awkward.
Yeah, no, but you're right. It's very Jack the Ripper coded. And that's also a huge difference from Orlok, right? Like, if you see Orlok coming at you, you're done. But Dracula's walking around in his top hat.
Yeah, he's part of the crowd. His first crime he commits, also Jack the Ripper vibes, is he attacks and presumably kills a flower seller.
Which is not a euphemism.
No, it's not. But I mean, I wonder if there's something there. Like, so Jack the Ripper, all that happened in 1888. So that's about 50 years before this movie came out. And I looked it up. Tod Browning was born in 1880. So I don't know if, like, in the middle of nowhere, Kentucky, that he was from, he would have heard of Jack the Ripper. But, like, the imagery and some of the, like, sexual undertones to Dracula, especially in how he interacts within the city context, really, really felt Ripper to me. And it's interesting. I mean, I don't think Browning would have known this at all. Obviously, we still don't know who Jack the Ripper is today, unless you're one of those people who have a firm theory on the matter, which personally I do not.
And frankly, good for you if you do.
I'm glad you have closure. Good for you. But one of the suspects is Prince Albert, who was Queen Victoria's grandson. So and there are various, like, gentlemen who have been, proposed as Jack the Ripper. So the image of a guy with a cape and a top hat and a cane, like, is very familiar to that.
Yeah. And, comparing to Nosferatu for a second, like, he's not bringing plague per se. And so you have an interesting, different kind of metaphor for what he can be, because you look at Nosferatu, it's very much a weird foreigner bringing a literal plague. And here it's an aristocrat.
It is
literally draining the blood of the lower classes.
Yeah.
And this is in the Depression.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, I think you could probably make a case that Van Helsing is perceived as a more foreign body than Dracula is in this film.
It's true. So there's a book that I read about the history of horror in America, written by David Scull, called The Monster Show. And in this book, he makes an interesting point that post-World War I, the defining monsters in culture, you look at Frankenstein, you look at Dracula. One of them is a mangled body destroyed and held together by technology, which is very war. And the other is a powerful European rich person. And it's interesting how...
Who acts counter to science.
He is very much in a sort of a spiritualistic kind of world. And, Skull kind of makes the point that after World War II, when we're going into the 50s, where suddenly there's, the information airways are suddenly just jam-packed with radio and television. And, we're suddenly getting so much information. The monsters are bug-eyed creatures with big heads.
Yep.
Yeah. But here we have...
Checks out.
But here we have, the specter of European war and money.
And I mean, to move on, on a little bit, that's really exemplified by the first place Dracula goes, which is, as any tourist new to London would do, Dracula heads to the theater.
Oh yeah, the opera.
Yeah.
The Grand Ole Opry.
Where apparently they'd filmed The Phantom of the Opera.
Yeah, same location.
So, more ties.
Oh, Universal Studios.
Yeah.
Thrifty. But the reason he's there is because Renfield has been arrested for all the murders, which he didn't do. He only cheered them on. But there was that wonderful shot on the boat where he's just kind of standing there at the bottom of the stairs, kind of looking up and giggling, and it's such a classic image of the genre. But he's been arrested and he's in a sanatorium, and Dr. Seward runs that sanatorium, and he's at the opera tonight. And so Dracula's kind of, wheelie-dealing his way to...
Yeah, and of course he is their neighbor now, because he's bought the abbey next door.
Which is just equally massive and crumbly.
Yes.
Like he really has a type of house.
And they're basically like to him, oh, so I bet you're gonna have to do a lot of renovations on the abbey. He's like, not really.
He likes it that way.
Yeah.
But this is where he meets Dr. Seward. He meets Mina Seward, Dr. Seward's daughter, which is a change from the book. She instead of being Mina Murray, Mina's are they married at this point? I think they're just...
I think he's her beau.
Her beau, Jonathan Harker, who is somehow more useless than Thomas Hutter.
He's so useless.
And David Manners, who plays him, like he would go his whole life never watching this movie.
Yeah.
And also Mina.
It's not a nuanced performance.
It's not a nuance, but he was an up and coming romantic lead.
Yeah, listen, he's a good looking guy.
Yeah, he's the blandest man you'll ever meet.
It's true.
And of course you have Mina's friend Lucy, and Dracula makes their acquaintance, and he chats to them, and they enjoy his company, and he says that great line about how there are worse things in this world than death.
Yes.
And
Lucy is hard. It falls hard for this.
Lucy is hard for him. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. They have their sleepover. She and Mina. Which in the Spanish version is a little bit more revealing because they could. And Lucy is imitating Dracula's accent, and they're going on about him, and
I think Mina's making fun of him.
Is that Mina?
Yeah, and and Lucy's the one who's like, no, I really like him.
The funny thing is, you mentioned while watching that scene that like there is kind of a sprightly kind of vibe,
almost
vibe
naturalistic. Yeah, that probably felt like the most non-1930s black and white film scene to me.
Yeah, it's interesting because I guess they're not really doing plot here, right? They're just they're talking about the guy, but they're not talking about exposition, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't pass the Bechdel test, but
No, they are. Well, is Dracula even a man?
That's true. Good point.
But yeah, no, like minutes later, Dracula shows up and bites Lucy. Although we don't see it because here's a fun fact.
We never see anyone biting anyone directly.
Yeah. These movies are pre the Hays Code. The Hays Code is a few years later, and the Hays Code really restricts what kind of violence and lewd behavior and language and other potential allusions to unseemly behavior, like men holding hands,
communism,
crime winning Jews, Anyway, things get really heavily censored after the Hays Code. This is before the Hays Code, and there is censorship in this era. It kind of depends on like state by state. These movies get really mangled depending on the state they play in. But even then, they're really not showing violence in this movie. Like
No.
Bela Lugosi doesn't get to wear fangs.
Yeah.
He's so famous for the fangs. He doesn't have fangs.
Yep.
He does textually because they find Lucy's body with bite holes, but we don't even see the bite holes.
Don't we?
No,
we don't.
we don't. In the Spanish version, we do.
Oh, that's right. But we do hear them described. Van Helsing later describes them literally as like two dot. Like, hang on, I think I wrote it down. Whatever. They're like two, dots very close together with like red circles with white inside, and I'm like, so a mosquito bite.
But yeah, no, they can't save Lucy. They do a blood
They don't really
transfusion.
try. I mean, it's a very short scene. They're basically like, Okay, she's dead.
They have a blood transfusion, but we don't really see it. We're told that there's a bunch of blood transfusions, but we don't really see any of that. They're in a big, like surgery theater. But this is where we get to meet our actual protagonist of the movie, the only person who is willing to stand up to this count, and that is man of science and man of God, Dr. Van Helsing, played by Edward Van Sloan.
Is his first name Abraham?
Do they say that in this movie?
I don't think so, but if it is, then Bram Stoker gave him his own first name, which is hilarious.
I think he's Abraham in the book.
I cannot be the first person to point that out, but
I'm
just saying.
Such a Mary Sue, that Van Helsing.
I love the idea that maybe like Lucy didn't actually die of the vampire bite. She died because they were giving her like the wrong blood type.
Yeah. But yeah, no, it's funny, Van Helsing is the one who starts to wonder, and it's such a shift from Nosferatu, where authority can't do anything and you kind of have to take matters into your own hands, where this is the man with the expertise. He knows science, he knows religion, he knows folklore, he is a man, he is a father figure, and he is going to come in and be very paternalistic to everybody, especially the ladies, and he's going to explain...
But Dr. Seward as well.
And Dr. Seward. And he is going to explain what the hell's going on. And, by the way, side note, Renfield keeps breaking out.
Yeah. It's actually a really funny thread in the movie where, like, they basically keep he just keeps popping up in the Seward household.
Yeah, and that's a hangover from the play, right? Because you need to get everybody on the stage at the same time. And how do you do that if Renfield's in jail, So he just keeps showing up. He just walks in. He just wants to hang.
And that helps because there are two comic relief characters in this movie. I guess not counting Renfield. But I don't know if they have names, but there's a maid and there is an orderly who just like keeps following...
Doing the full Dick Van Dyke.
Yeah, he keeps following Renfield around. And this is a good place to mention, I think, that the accents in this movie, as it is supposed to be set in London and England generally, are the worst I've ever heard.
It's pretty out there.
It's a travesty.
These are people who are trained to do transatlantic accents. And they're being told to do something else here, and they are confused.
Yeah, they do not. They're like, I met a British person once when I was 5, and that is it.
But yeah, so Van Helsing shows up. He explains that's the undead, and somebody says, "Oh, it's Nosferatu," and so we get that word in there. And Renfield is upset by being shown wolfsbane, which is a big vampire repellent in this, because Van Helsing knows all the tricks. And
also keep in mind that there is a wolf connection with vampires.
That's true. In this incarnation, unlike Orlok, who brings with him swarms of rats, and maybe turns into rats, is kind of unclear, Dracula turns into bats and wolves.
Yes.
We see the bats. We do not see the wolves. We're told that it happens because at one point Harker runs off and says, "What's that? A big dog?" But we don't see it. We never see transformations in this movie.
No.
They don't have the wherewithal.
No.
And that's probably part of why turning into a wolf didn't quite stick as much as it did in the culture.
In the lore, yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
Like, people know about it, but he's the bat guy.
Well, we've also created a very strong dichotomy between werewolves and vampires, and I think crossing those streams confuses people.
This is very true. And by the way, Universal will go on to do a Wolfman movie.
I mean, yeah, of
that
course.
has very heavy, like, hex lore and whatnot. Bela Lugosi's in that. But yeah, so Van Helsing knows that there is a vampire doing all this.
Yeah, well, actually, to the point that he explicitly defines what a vampire is, which I thought was important to note, because we don't really get a ton of that in the first movie. Just to quote directly, "The vampire, Mr. Harker, is a thing that lives after its death by drinking the blood of the living. It must have blood or it dies. Its power lasts only from sunset to sunrise. During the hours of the day, it must rest in the earth in which it was buried." And that's pretty much it. So again, we don't get garlic. We don't get the "you can't cross the threshold," which actually is a big deal in this movie because Dracula is just flying into people's houses like all the time.
He does not need to be invited.
I'm not even sure that Lucy left her window open, and yet he is still in there.
I'm starting to wonder if the papers he signed just include all of London. It's like an Arab.
Oh my gosh.
By the way, side note, Renfield does not have anybody in his life.
No.
I guess he's just like this lone lawyer who has no friends, no family, no partners. There's nobody for him. And he is so sympathetic in this movie because he's so besotted with Dracula, but he also is kind of torn up about it. And he's like, he wants to warn people, and he doesn't want Mina to become, Draculized because she's starting to get Draculized.
Yeah, he has moments of clarity that are really sad because he starts to realize how many people he's killed, and and when he's kind of not lucid, he's like, I want to eat all the flies, like just eat all the flies.
Oh, but what he really wants are spiders, fat, juicy spiders. God. But it's funny, like, you thought that the character of Knock in Nosferatu was the most sympathetic character. Mm-hmm. And this is Knock 2.0.
Yes, definitely.
And he's sympathetic for different reasons. No one's chasing him around. People are very willing to hang with him.
It's true. It's actually, like, we say sanatorium. It looks like, I don't know if it would hold up to our standards today, but a pretty humane place.
It's like a rehab center.
Yeah, there are gardens. There, nobody seems to be locked in their room. Well, maybe Renfield should be, but...
He bends the bars, and everybody's kind of like, oh, what can you do?
Yeah.
But yeah, no, Dracula gives Mina a bite, and she's starting to show symptoms, and people are a little concerned about this.
Yeah, and she attributes most of this initially to a dream, and that's when Dr. Van Helsing is like, oh no, not a dream, real thing.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, nice story. Can I see under that scarf?
Yeah. I actually got really strong, like, I don't know what it's even called, that, urban legend of the woman with the ribbon around her neck.
Oh, yeah, the green ribbon.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's so funny when he unravels that, and he's like, so where'd you get those bite marks? And everybody's like, what?
Yeah.
And she's like, I didn't think to bring it up.
Well, that's also, I mean, in a different context, in a non-supernatural context, that is a sexual reference.
Oh, yeah.
And, the idea that this very chaste relationship between, well, he's really called John. He's not really called Jonathan, which I wonder if there's some politics there. But
Johnny boy.
Yeah, between John and Mina is like, in a certain way, like very, very, sorry. This very chaste relationship between John and Mina is really threatened, actually, by the presence of Dracula. And, you can obviously just view it plain, like he's gonna kill Mina because he's a vampire and turn her into a vampire. But there's also like a almost romantic or sexual competition there.
Yeah, I mean, she doesn't just fall prey to him; she kind of falls under his thrall in a way that feels very charged.
Yes.
Bela Lugosi is a sexy motherfucker.
He is.
That's how he plays it. He is the anti-Orlok.
And you know who's not? The guy who plays John.
The guy who plays Jonathan is strictly missionary.
It's like white bread.
Yeah, no, Dracula's he's exotic in all the ways. He's just exciting, and he knows it, and by the way, the way he plays it too, he's if Orlok is like this weird inhuman thing trying to be a person and kind of failing at it. Mm-hmm. Bela Lugosi's Dracula is the cat who ate the canary.
Oh, yes.
Like, his smile is so wide.
Yeah.
And he just knows he's getting away with so much.
Yeah.
And knows that he'll continue getting away with so much. Like, even when he's actually challenged by Van Helsing, he does his great little, mirror thing.
Van Helsing is like, oh, I know what to do. Please take this cigarette case, which conveniently has a mirror inside, and Dracula just flings it away.
He's so offended.
He's like, yeah.
He's so offended.
He's like, damn, the game's up.
And there are so many ways that could have played corny, right?
Yeah.
Frankly, in the Spanish,
I mean, it's a little corny, but
Yeah, but and yet it kind of works. So, in the Spanish version, that actor can't pull it off. He's like, oh no, I've been tricked.
Yeah.
But here,
it's like reflexive.
Yeah, it's like he didn't expect it, but immediately he's so betrayed. And you can see on his face, he knows that Van Helsing knows.
Yeah.
And that there's no point in denying it. And then he recomposes himself and says, he'll explain to you what I am. Yeah. I'll see you around. Yeah. And he leaves.
Well, he leaves via the balcony.
Bat flies up.
He doesn't actually turn into a bat, but it is a little bit like, where did you guys think he was going?
No, he turns into a wolf because Johnny goes over there, looks over there, is like, what's that, a big dog? And Helsing is like, Yeah.
All right, so school time.
Yeah, so the cat's out of the bag. Dude's a vampire.
Yeah.
And it kind of takes a moment to convince people, but like it becomes pretty clear because Mina's falling under a spell. Lucy's a vampire now, and she's killing children, but that never gets brought up again.
It does not, but I did want to bring up kind of, I don't know if we need like a content warning at the front of this episode, but like there is like a tiny ring of pedophilia in the Lucy plot line, because it's very, very specific about how there's this woman in white walking around at night, and you hear a child screaming, and, you know, these children are being murdered, and, like, I don't know that that would have occurred to anyone in 1933. I mean, obviously that happened, but I don't know if it was as in the consciousness. But, like, to me, especially when you consider, like, how it kind of not hidden Dracula's sexuality is for the time, to me it stood out very clearly.
And my understanding is that's from the book, that Lucy targets children, and that the ones who survive try to describe her as the beautiful lady, but they have pronunciation issues. They call her the Bloofer lady, and that's her moniker, the Bloofer lady. And it's fascinating to me that they included that in this movie. Never follow up on it, which makes me think that they did initially, but they cut it out.
Well, they did in I think in the Spanish version.
Right.
You hear that she's gotten staked.
Yeah, which makes sense. I think that Universal was concerned about the pacing and just cut chop. But it is a loose thread
they kill Dracula at the end. Spoiler, but they don't kill Lucy.
Yeah, Lucy's still out there. She is a Lucy thread. But it's interesting. Two things. One, she walks like a bride, right? She's got her white on. She's walking slowly, kind of in a trance, in that very sort of 1930s I walked with a zombie kind of a way. And two, this is quite the departure from Orlok, who did not make more of himself.
Right.
He just plagued.
Yeah.
Right? He was just driven by hunger and that sort of predatory vibe, but he wasn't clever about it. He was just, I'm going to a place, and I'm going to drink who I can, and incidentally people are going to die. But he's not trying to propagate.
Yeah.
Dracula is intentionally trying to propagate. Like, his big master plan at the end of this is that he wants Mina. He wants to make a bride out of Mina, right? And, you know, there's this great moment with Van Helsing where Dracula shows up and they have a sort of game of wits.
Yeah.
Where Dracula tries to hypnotize him and fails. And
he almost does it.
It. But then Van Helsing pulls out his cross like a gunslinger.
It literally is like a gunslinger. It's bad.
Yeah.
And hilarious.
And it's so cool. And it's so, like, I have a lot of issues with this movie, but there's something really fun about this God versus Satan thing happening here, where it's like, it's a very Christian, like, I know what you are, you know what I am, you know that we're at war, everyone knows we're at war. This is about one little parry in the battlefield.
Yeah,
you know?
And who's going to win the queen, kind of, you know?
And get thee behind me, Satan!
And then, you know, there's another really interesting line that is actually, I think, a little earlier in the movie, is Van Helsing, again, saying that, like, modern medical science does not admit to the existence of such a creature. And it's like, but Dracula exists. And there is a very strong distinction between, like, and there's just such a fascinating, like, combination in Van Helsing, right? Between both the man of faith and this man who knows both science and beyond science and is kind of the master of all.
Yeah, there's no dichotomy, really. It sort of plays like, this is a, you know, post World War I, slightly before World War II. There's a patriarchal society. There's an authority that you listen to who know what they're talking about, and they tell you what the facts are. The facts just happen to include science and religion. Those are just the facts, and they are agreed upon. And if you don't believe in them, then you're a silly child or a woman. But listen to your, you know, to your leaders who know what they're talking about. And that's Van Helsing. He's the guy who just knows what's up. And it's at a time, it's a very religious society at the time. So there wouldn't have been that friction, right? It would have just been, science is what we know science to be, because we're in a highly, you know, speedy technological era where things are just kind of getting built in new ways, and you know, things are being invented right and left, and we've been at war and we're going to be at war again. But also the church is just a fact, you know. And Mr. Van Helsing, he knows the score.
He's got all the cards.
He is the Pope. But yeah, so Mina is now she's being weird at John.
She breaks up with him.
She breaks up with him. Love triangle.
Yeah,
with Dracula.
I mean, very much so. It's very clear. But she also she kind of follows Renfield down that path of like moments of being overtaken by Dracula and moments of lucidity, and it's very interesting how those. I think the actress is actually really good in handling that. This is though where we get that scene where she is, talking to Dracula, but he's just the bat, and Jonathan is trying to like shake off the bat. So she's just like talking into the air, but she's not saying, she's like responding. So it's like, yes, oh, and it just it's so badly directed, that scene. I'm sorry.
John is just swinging around in a rubber bat.
Exactly.
Held over. And then as soon as he's done, he says to her, "What are you talking?" She's like, "Oh, nothing."
Yeah.
By the way, would you mind just stealing Van Helsing's crucifix real quick? Can you just kind of snatch it away from him? But they're trying to treat her with wolfsbane, and she's really pushing back.
She
on
can't
that.
sleep because they filled her room with wolfsbane, and she has a very silly maid who like removes the wolfsbane because she can't sleep. And
there is some interesting gender politics happening here.
Yeah.
She's protesting, but the men know what's right for her, and the maid is just kind of trying to follow along.
Yeah. Well, nobody asked Mina. Her opinion is not solicited in any way. It's basically like, here's what you're supposed to do. Either from Van Helsing, who at least might know some stuff, but also from her father, and particularly from Harker. Like, at one point, he like tries to take her away, and he's just like, "We're leaving." It's like
and that's that.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's interesting that they don't act like they're scared for her life as much as they're just sort of like treating her like a child of like, we're going to fix this.
Yes.
Just stop ruining it. Mm-hmm. Just listen to us and chill, and we'll handle it.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like there's a very slight undercurrent of, if you're not listening, it's because you're not smart enough to understand.
Yeah. It sort of feels like...
And you're not strong enough, right? Like, well, I could sleep in a room full of wolfsbane. Like, well, yeah, because you're not half a vampire.
Yeah, there's no... It's almost like they're not judging her because they just assume, like, obviously she's not up for the task. Mm-hmm. Like, she's just not built for it.
Right.
Which is so paternalistic.
Yeah.
Especially compared to in Nosferatu, where she is doing research, she is making plans, she's sending away her husband so that she can enact her plan. Scientists aren't listening to her. Mm-hmm. And here she's just sort of like, help me out, I'm fine. They're like, yeah, sure, hush now.
Yeah, very much so. And that's kind of around then when we get the pivot from the conversation of like saving a life versus saving a soul.
Yeah, there's the sense of, if she turns into a vampire, at the very least, can they promise to stake her? Mm-hmm. Which is interesting and very religious.
Yeah, we also get this bizarre lore dump from Dracula that like they can save Lucy's soul if they kill her or if she dies by day, but if she dies by night, she belongs to Dracula.
Yeah, and by the way, side note, we don't know for sure that sunlight is fatal to Dracula.
Exactly, that's not stipulated. It's just that they spend the day sleeping in their coffins.
Yeah, vampires have power at night, and during the day they are cadavers in coffins, mm-hmm. and so he's planning to kill her at night so that she will then rise from the grave at night and be a vampire. And Renfield he's wandering on in, and he's warning about this because he's having all sorts of pangs of conscience and mm-hmm. still being a weirdo, but he's like, I don't, like, you gotta save her soul, you know? Like, there's a very sympathetic dude.
We needed a scene with Lucy and why do I keep saying Lucy? With Mina and Renfield. Yeah,
they don't get to share a scene. I have a lovely comic that came out recently that was written by James Tynion. Something is Killing the Children and Nice House on the Lake. He wrote his own take on Dracula that's very Universal inspired, and I think it's actually commissioned by Universal. So it has a lot of the similar visuals, and his Renfield, who looks a lot like Conrad Veidt,
just way creepier.
Way creepier. The art
like his face is melting.
The art is gorgeous. Who's the artist? The artist is Martin Simmons. Martin Simmons. So Martin Simmons' art is great, but in that, Renfield and Mina have a lot of scenes together, which makes sense because there's this moment in this movie where he's, behind bars and Dracula is communicating to him telepathically, and Renfield's saying, like, no, not her, not her, which is fascinating. But of course, it's going to be her. She wanders off with him, after having broken up with Johnny, which, by the way, love triangle with the vampire is hinted at in Nosferatu, tiny bit.
That's true.
Because he's clearly lusting after her.
Yes, and her beautiful neck.
Yeah, and she's obviously going to lure him in. But the actual, like, her having feelings, right? Her being like, I want to be with him, I don't want to be with you. That is going to be a recurring motif in Dracula Dumb and Nosferatu Dumb. That's going to be in the New Eggers version. Like, that is a lasting impact.
Interesting. Yeah, so then the film starts to wrap up. I would say finally, but it's not a long film, actually.
Yeah, it's 74 minutes long.
Yeah.
It's a very short movie. It feels a little long.
Yeah.
Because a lot of it is talking about exposition in pretty safe rooms.
Yes.
And Dracula doesn't do a lot of the cool stuff that happens in the story kind of happens off screen.
Yeah, I mean, when he and Van Helsing have their showdown, he says, like, oh, it's too late. Mina has my blood flowing through her veins, which obviously means that he has made Mina drink his blood, which is charged. We see none of it. It's the only reason we know what happened is because Dracula tells us in this scene.
A lot of the coolest stuff that happens in this movie we do not get to see. We don't get to see him attacking on the boat, really. We don't get to see much of the violence that he does. We never see him actually bite somebody. We see him descend on people. We never see Lucy attacking people. We just kind of hear about it. We never see Dracula transform into anything. There's just a lot of stuff that we don't get to see. And part of that I have to give grace to the fact that it's a low-budget movie in the 30s that is, working with what they have, limited technology, limited budget. It's all very new with sound. But we know that there's a certain artistry that was temporarily lost after the silence era. Where the medium kind of lost its artistic footing. It became so much less dynamic.
It was more tell and less show.
Exactly. And so, like we'll talk more about this, but this isn't my favorite adaptation. But we're now in the climax where Dracula has spirited away Mina to Carfax Abbey.
Not Lucy.
Not Lucy, Mina. Which, by the way, that switch is going to be so interesting in the Herzog version.
Oh God, is Lucy the main character in that?
Oh yeah.
Oh, I'm going to be saying Mina the whole time.
Oh yeah, no, that's going to be fun. But they're running off to Carfax Abbey, and Renfield is chasing off after them like a weird little lunatic, and John and Van Helsing chase after them, and that's how they find out that Dracula is at the house that he bought. Yeah. Where he said that he lived. Yeah. Which feels like something they should have known.
You would think.
And they peek inside, and Dracula finds out that they're there, gets mad at Renfield for having led them there, which, again, Dracula told them his address, but poor Renfield, he doesn't catch a break. It's a beautiful shot. It's a big wide shot, this big staircase with no
I think it could have used a couple of close-ups, but they probably didn't have the capacity to move the camera on the stairs.
Yeah. Dracula gives Renfield a little, Dracula gives Renfield a little old school Universal Studios killing. Kind of wraps his hands on him. Renfield makes a noise, falls off the stairs.
Yeah. And before that, Renfield is like, don't kill me, I can't die with all those lives on my conscience, with all this blood on my hands. And it's really very, I don't know, I'm becoming Team Knox/Renfield, like, hardcore here.
Truly the most compelling character in this movie.
Yeah.
And I kind of wish that they had done some more with it. And from the Spanish cut, we know that there was more, that he had tried to make a deal with Van Helsing to, like, save his soul. Like, trying to play both sides. Like, there's something fun there that they could have played on. But still, the idea of this poor guy is just doing everything Dracula's telling him to do, and it's just never enough. And, well, we don't have any allegory for that these days. Wouldn't it be fun to, like... Could you imagine somebody just, like, being super loyal to somebody who's just completely willing to screw them over.
No, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Won't even talk to them once they've won you over, and like no matter what you do, it's just never enough, and then they're going to throw you under the bus. Like, I can't imagine that kind of fandom. It's just impossible. But anyway, exit Renfield.
Exit Renfield, and we have a rather kind of static and boring scene, honestly, in the basement where Van Helsing and Harker do find the coffins, and then it's so weird because Van Helsing opens up what's supposed to be Mina, not Lucy, Mina's coffin, and like peers in and then lowers the lid, right? And then Jonathan's like, "Is she in there?" He's like, "No," and he lifts it again. And he's like, "No, she's not in there."
They try to milk it for suspense.
Yeah.
It doesn't really work. I applaud the effort of like, oh no, did they kill her? But like, we know that they didn't.
Yeah, and then he sends Harker off to get not even a stake, like something to pound the stake. Yeah, like a rock or something. And then you hear a big scream and Dracula's dead.
Yeah. Again, early days of talkies. This is the first talkie horror feature as far as I can tell.
Mm-hmm.
This movie must have been very scary for a lot of people. But there's no climax.
No.
Like, the whole big final battle is Dracula decides to go to bed.
Yeah.
And they catch him asleep.
It's much more dramatic. Renfield's climax is much more dramatic than anything that actually happens with Dracula.
Yeah, and they try to sort of intellectually get us to understand that this is like a big deal because if Dracula has killed Mina at this point, then she is doomed to be a vampire or to be killed a vampire. But like, that's intellectual. Visually, what we're seeing is the most charismatic actor in this movie has decided during the climax now is a good time to take a nap.
Yep.
I hope that they don't find me in my very obvious bed.
Yeah.
And they kill him off screen.
Like, we don't even see a shot of him in the coffin.
Yeah, we don't see it. We hear his final death cry, which, by the way, upon re-release a few years later, per the censors, they removed that scream.
Oh.
Because you can't have that. So.
Oh my gosh!
And then we find Mina, and she's fine, and she's snapped out of her trance, and she reveals that she was going to be killed, but Dracula got scared off by sunlight that was coming on in that we didn't see, which is sort of a devil's bargain for the film, I guess, because they want the suspense, but then we don't get to see that.
Right.
We don't get to see Dracula fleeing the sunlight in this movie.
Ever.
Contrast that with Nosferatu, which has such a strong final image of Nosferatu, of Orlok, right?
Yeah. And, I mean, a presence for Mina in the finale. Like, she's literally a prop in this one. You know, Dracula's carrying her down the stairs. Like, it's very... Is that this one of the Spanish version that she's carried down the stairs? I don't remember.
In both versions.
In both versions. Whatever. Great shot. But yeah, she's literally like... She's like slumped by a wall when Harker finds her. And she's just like, oh, yeah, I was saved by the sun.
The ladies in this movie are prone to fainting.
Yeah.
The maid faints because she sees Renfield, who's like a weird little guy, and therefore so scary she must faint. Dracula literally carries Mina around, and it's kind of luck that he doesn't kill her at that point. Like, it really is just timing, and it's just sort of luck that Van Helsing and Jonathan, like, they find the bodies where they are supposed to be, and
they look in
them.
the right place in the big basement of Carfax Abbey.
It's a real anticlimax, and I understand that in the book it's a much more significant climax with like
that I do remember. Yes,
a lot of people ganging up on this guy, and you know it's a big old fight. But here, this movie doesn't really have violence, visual violence on the mind. Like, the most striking visual thing that happens violently is Dracula kind of strangles Renfield a little bit, and he falls off the stairs. But everything else is hidden behind the curtain of the cape or off screen.
right.
And it's all very intellectualized and expository, and then the movie's done. It just kind of ends. And there is a credit scene that has been lost to time because the censors hated it, because it promoted the belief in the supernatural, where Van Helsing on the Broadway show it was Dracula doing this.
Oh,
but here it was Van Helsing getting in front of the camera and saying, "We hope that this little movie of ours hasn't scared you too much and it won't give you nightmares, and just know when you go to bed tonight, there are such things as vampires." And that's cute. And they do a similar thing at the beginning of Frankenstein shortly thereafter. But
I can see that actually being quite effective at the time.
Too effective because it was so scary.
Yeah, so scary.
that the censors were like, "You can't tell me the vampires are real. I can't handle it." But they cut it. And the movie just kind of stops.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't end. It stops.
And That's our Dracula, and it's. So I want to say a thing about Tod Browning, the director.
Please do.
Tod Browning was, growing up, he was a carny. He ran away from home, joined the circus, lived on the road with carnival freaks, and he had an act where he would be buried alive. Everybody would watch as he's lowered into the ground in a coffin, which had, secretly an air apparatus and some milk duds. And then a few years later, people would get, not a few years later, a few days later, people would gather around and see oh, they dug him up and he's alive. And that was his thing. And,
Talk about kids today not having the patience for that.
Oh, that was the entertainment of the time. And, sometimes the carnival would be busted by the police because they would have their shows on Sundays. And it was a whole big thing. Eventually he joins film, has a pretty good career in Hollywood for a while. He's kind of checked out in this movie, and that's sort of corroborated by cast. I'm pretty sure it was David Manners and Helen Chandler, who plays Mina, who said that he wasn't really super attentive on set. He didn't really care, and that a lot of this was directed by the cinematographer, which you kind of get because the dialogue scenes are just kind of flat, and the stuff that's really striking are these tableaus that we get moments of that you can tell the cinematographer put a lot of work into that. But apparently Tod Browning was kind of not super present, and the studio didn't have a ton of faith in this movie, and that's why they cut it down as much as they did. But the audience loved it. Top box office movie of 1931.
Wow.
Saved Universal Studios, kickstarted the Universal Monsters line, launched a genre basically, scandalized a nation because how dare you show something quite as scary. But
it's a man who's biting another man.
But talk to me about your thoughts watching this movie, because this is your first time watching this.
Yeah, it's funny. One thing I do think a lot about is the kind of the fear factor. And I was laughing more than I was at all scared. But I was also very impressed with Bela Lugosi. Not to be all Cape Game strong, but Cape Game incredibly strong. He works that thing. And you can tell that there's you can tell, I guess, who has the lore of the story kind of working in their performances and who is kind of just there, which, no hate, a job's a job. But, there is a real sense of that the scene with Van Helsing and Dracula when they confront each other, sure, it's very awkward in certain points. When Dracula is trying to mind control Van Helsing, he's literally just standing there scowling with his hand pointed out and just nothing happens. But you get the sense of energy between the actors. And yeah, I was surprised. I was disappointed by the lack of agency on Mina's behalf, especially, it doesn't, obviously cinema doesn't work like this because life doesn't work like this in a straight line, but you would assume that a movie made in 1922 would be more regressive than a movie made in 1930 or 31. And that's not the case for this, at least as far as Mina goes.
Yeah, Nosferatu feels kind of punk rock compared to this.
Yeah.
And Van Sloan would go on to denigrate this movie a ton. He would just talk about how little he thought of it. And, Helen Chandler, as Mina, she thought this movie kind of hurt her career. And, David Manners, he never even saw it, even as an old man. And once it had the impact that it did on the culture, he still refused to watch it. The people who give the best performances in this are Dwight Frye as Renfield, who is wild. No
offense to the stage Renfield, but, he's great.
Dwight Frye owns the role.
Yeah.
He defines it for generations. The recent film, Renfield, pulls pretty heavily from Dwight Frye.
Yeah, I'm excited to get around to that one.
It does typecast him. He becomes Fritz in Frankenstein, which is the person who we sort of misremember as Igor.
Okay.
He becomes the weird little guy, the weird little assistant, and that is a shame for him because he was an up and coming actor with a lot of potential. But he is iconic in this role. He's giving it his all, and the reason the movie survives is Bela Lugosi. He is magnetic.
Yeah.
With what he has to work with, which isn't really a ton. As you can see in the Spanish version, the actor they have there just doesn't cut it.
No.
But Lugosi, and here's the thing too, it's such a different type of performance from Orlok, from Max Schreck, not just in terms of the character type, but also in terms of how you're going to play it.
Right.
And Max Schreck plays it as the sort of pantomime of a creature, right? He plays it as a demon who should not exist, this predator who was just staring at you. Bela Lugosi also never blinks in this movie, but he is playing it as he isn't playing a demon, he's playing Satan.
Right.
And he is so wonderful in the role. And even though he only ever played Dracula one more time in Abbott and Costello was it Meet the Wolfman? Which one was it? Oh, God, I have to check this now. Oh, God.
By the way, Bela Lugosi, nutcase.
Yeah, weird guy. Weird guy.
Married 5 times.
Yeah, and they all had complaints.
Yep.
He had a real ego to him, too. He wanted to play heartthrobs, when they offered him the Frankenstein monster and revealed that it was going to be a mute role. He turned it down because he wanted,
he was an actor.
He was a leading man. Yeah. In his mind, he was a leading man, and also he really kind of loved the sex appeal of Dracula. Okay, he plays Count Dracula in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein 17 years later. And yet, we all remember Bela Lugosi as Dracula. He is the Dracula. And he is going to have an impact on every subsequent Dracula.
Yes, I'm really excited to see what people take from it.
So much. The cape, for one.
The cape, yeah.
Obviously, we all have the accent now. The accent's the thing. But the whole hypnotic eyes thing, he's a Svengali, essentially. And that sticks around.
It's almost like, and this is funny because Doug Jones did just play Dracula, I believe, right?
He did.
Nosferatu.
He played Orlok in a Nosferatu movie.
Right. But it's almost like the character goes from a Doug Jones performance to a, I don't know, Oscar Isaac performance,
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
And both excellent actors and both, incredible at what they do, but obviously doing very different things.
It's a really strong thing they do, especially compared to subsequent Universal Studios monster movies, that this monster is suave, right? All the other monsters, you look at Frankenstein, right? You look at the Wolfman, you look at the Mummy, you look at the creature from the Black Lagoon, and they're all kind of feral. Even the Mummy is a little bit feral. He's played by Boris Karloff, and so he has a little bit of a lumbering. He speaks and he's eloquent, but he's not quite as charismatic. There's something a little off about him. But Dracula, the first one they start off with, they don't play him as a monster. They play him as an evil man with a lot of confidence. Yeah. And the confidence...
It really very much is kind of the Miltonian Satan.
Oh, yeah. Honestly, all he needs is the goatee.
Yeah.
So it should be noticed that this movie does save Universal Studios. It does launch the monster line. There is a sequel, a direct sequel, called Dracula's Daughter. Bela Lugosi's not in it, but there is Dracula's Daughter is going around town. There are a lot of great lesbian undertones to it.
Nice. Who's Dracula's mother? Is that ever addressed?
This is where I admit that it's been a long time since I saw Dracula's Daughter, but I remember thinking it's interesting. I think they don't play her as quite as evil. I think they sort of play her as conflicted, but I'll have to check. But it does sort of reach back to, if we're looking at, precedent. You get a little Carmilla in there, right? You have in literature the Carmilla vampire. I think before Dracula, right? Yeah. So that starts to arise a bit. Dracula, of course, as a character in Universal, comes back. He's played a bunch by Lon Chaney Jr.
Oh.
Lon Chaney Jr. is the guy who will eventually have played all of these monsters.
Wow, that's crazy.
Most specifically, he's the Wolfman. But he will play Frankenstein's monster. He will play Dracula. He's not... I don't love him as a performer. There's a certain charm to him, but he's not quite... No one's Bela Lugosi.
Right.
Other people come and go. We have a Carradine comes in there. I can't remember
Christopher Lee.
Okay, so So that's down the line. So
Right.
Universal, the monsters kind of lose their charm a bit with audiences. People kind of stop paying to see them. The quality kind of drops a bit after time. After some good sequels, but kind of drops off. They sort of become passe. They kind of become a joke.
They start putting in just a whole bunch of villains in each movie.
Well, the cycle ends with the Abbott and Costello movies.
Oh, that's canonical?
That's, well, in the sense of it's by Universal and it has the same actors.
Oh my god.
Right, that's where you do have Bela Lugosi in there as Dracula. I believe you have Lon Chaney Jr. in there. And that's kind of the end of that cycle for a while, and these monsters kind of become safe for audiences because they're just so well known. And the thing that revives Dracula as a scary concept instead of just sort of as one of those old-fashioned pre-World War II monsters is in 1958 in the UK. You have Hammer Studios, which makes a splash with their Frankenstein movie. Now they have a Dracula movie, Horror of Dracula, with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. Peter Cushing as Van Helsing, Christopher Lee as Dracula. They alternate roles for the Frankenstein stuff.
Oh, cool.
Which is real fun. But Christopher Lee, he brings back the horror. Like, those movies, I'm not super in love with them either just as movies, but they are culturally impactful, and they bring the gore into it. So now you actually have bright Technicolor blood. It's still the 50s, so it's a little bit limited.
Yeah, we should say we actually haven't really seen the most blood we've seen. I think is probably when Hutter slash well, in this one Renfield cuts their finger. Like that's the goriest we get.
Yeah, and then you have Horror of Dracula in 1958, and suddenly it's blood up the wazoo. It's a big grand guignol, very 50s makeup effects. It's the UK, and so there's a little bit more leeway there, and it's, Hammer's an independent studio. But they do Dracula, they do Frankenstein, they do the Wolfman, they do the Mummy, and they kind of bring back all of these creatures, and they kind of become popular again, and you start to see a whole lot more Dracula takes.
Are we watching the 58?
We could. I feel like it is worth potentially looking at in time, maybe to circle back, because I want to get back on track for Nosferatu, because Dracula 1931, important to see in the scheme of things. Like, I don't think you can look at the history of Nosferatu and skip Dracula 1931. But Phil Nobile of Fangoria put out a great little essay this week as we're recording this on December 9th, which is not a Tuesday, I'm sorry, that points out that the most used characters in Western literature, who appear in the most media, are Sherlock Holmes, Jesus, and Dracula. We're not going to cover most of Dracula. We're not going to cover most of Dracula. Bela Lugosi does play Jesus in a passion
hang
play.
on. That would be a movie.
Bela Lugosi does play Jesus.
That's true.
In a passion play. There's a great photo of him out there. If it's almost a thirst trap.
Yeah, but I feel like that is like the point of passion. Maybe I shouldn't say that.
But there's a lot of Dracula out there that kind of goes off in its own path. And there's sort of a fork in the road that happens with Nosferatu that I feel like they kind of, like, it sort of feels like train tracks. They go their separate ways.
Two paths diverged and
sometimes cross again. And they will cross again in some future picks. And I think the next one that I kind of want to look at is, before we do, do you want to talk about the Jewish element of this?
Let's talk about Nosferatu.
Do you see a Jewish element in this?
No. This is going to be a short section. Genuinely, no. And I think part of that is because, I mean, they really play up the count element, like there are references to rats made. I think somebody at some point is like, there were 1 million rats and their eyes were all red and blah, blah, blah. But you very much get Dracula, as we've said, as someone who fits into society, who is different, but is not, I guess, of a different type than what people of this social class are expecting and can handle. And I think that's very different. The closest Jewish thing that I could think of is actually probably the main suspect for Jack the Ripper was a Jewish Polish immigrant.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Ooh.
Well, Whitechapel in 1888 was full of Jews.
Wow.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah, someone wrote, like, one of the pieces of evidence is, like, somebody wrote some graffiti on a wall about the Jews, and, like, there are vampiric things you can think about with Jack the Ripper. Like, he is alleged to have eaten the flesh of some of his victims, just general bloodiness. And then also that idea of someone who can, whether he was very low class or high class, can invisibly fade into society, kind of no matter what carnage they've just left behind them. But yeah, it's a short Nosferatu section this week.
I love how first you are in Jack the Ripper, considering that you're the scaredy cat of the...
That's true.
But yeah, no, it really kind of says something to just how non-Jewish and how Christian this movie feels, considering the mitigating factors of he has a strong Hungarian accent. I have some Hungarian Jews in my lineage, and a lot of Jews fled Hungary.
Yep.
He has a 6-pointed star on his necklace.
Yes, although I think that is more like European medallion.
Yeah, it's sort of incidental.
Yeah.
And also the fact that, this is still in the era where, Jews and the descendants of Jewish immigrants were running the major studios. Carl Laemmle was Jewish.
What was that original name? I'm curious.
Let me find out for you. Well, Carl Laemmle Jr. was born Julius Laemmle and decided, I want to be like Dad. I wonder what Carla Laemmle's name was. Wait, actually, no. Let me find out. One second. What was Carla Laemmle's name? Oh, God. She was born Rebecca.
Oh, my goodness.
Rebecca Isabel Laemmle.
With a K.
With a K. That's very... Okay. But,
and an H.
And an H. She was Rivka.
That's amazing.
But Carl Laemmle himself was born Carl Laemmle, spelled slightly different. And yeah.
Well, he was German, so that actually makes a lot of sense. Because
that makes a lot of sense.
There was obviously a lot of integration in Germany in the late 18th century.
He did change his
19th century.
He did change the K in his name to a C.
I wonder how much of that was also like post World War One, or pre to post World War One. There was a lot of anti-German sentiment in the States.
That does track, and also removing the umlaut over the
A.
Oh yeah,
definitely. Yeah,
and adding an E after the A there. But yeah, I mean, Jews produced this. Mm-hmm. Jews did not write it. Mm-hmm. Jews did not direct it. Jews did not star in it.
Other than the fabulous Carla / Rebecca.
Yeah, and her with her great little high pitched voice.
In the Carpathian Mountains. It's really worth watching that first scene. It's very funny.
It's truly wonderful. But yeah, no, this is a very non-Jewish movie, and it doesn't feel like it doesn't feel like a metaphor in the way that you could read things into Nosferatu. Mm-hmm. So with that, I think the next one that we should look at. Do you want to do a scare factor, or did you already do a scare factor?
Yeah, I'll just touch on it again. 0. I was not scared at all watching this movie.
And you were not scared by Nosferatu, but I think you gave that a 2.
Yeah, but that has more plague stuff in it also.
That's true. It does get more under the skin.
Yeah. It's way more unheimlich, uncanny, whatever.
Bela Lugosi is an icon, but you're not going to lose sleep over.
No, and it's also, I wonder if this movie was way less famous and Dracula was way less patterned after Bela Lugosi, or less of a factor culturally, period. When I was making the cover art for our podcast, I typed in vampire into Canva and I got images of Bela Lugosi. And, it's so intertwined, you can't, it's too familiar to be scary.
Yeah. Honestly, I think the best surprise of rewatching this is that even though it's so well known to us, the whole archetype that Bela Lugosi creates for this is so well known to us and so kind of cliche, mm-hmm. is how impressive he does it.
Yes.
It's that
it does hold up as a performance for sure.
He doesn't just kick off the cliche, he peaks it.
Yeah.
And that's really something. But yeah, it's not a very scary movie.
Not so much.
No, it's just kind of a fun time, kind of slow. The directing of subsequent movies in this cycle Frankenstein and, and the Wolfman, and especially Bride of Frankenstein, the Invisible Man, there's a lot more flourish that comes into it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I would call any of those scary, but again, that's modern take, but also you get a lot more artistry out of the actual, mise en scène.
Right.
And so speaking of that, I think I'll stop hemming and hawing. I think the next one we should look at is 1979, Werner Herzog's remake of Nosferatu.
Oh, we're getting in a time machine.
I think we're going to jump ahead because there's a lot of vampire stuff in between, and we can come back to that for funsies. But in 1979, Werner Herzog, the German director, you all know his accent.
So we're going back to Germany.
We're going back to Germany. He has been on record saying that he believes Nosferatu, the original Nosferatu, is the greatest film ever made in Germany. Mm. And here he is doing a remake in color, in sound, but faithful to that version, but starting to pull some stuff back from Dracula because suddenly it's public domain. Mm-hmm. Suddenly the novel's public domain, and suddenly you can use some names and some ideas, and we start to see a little bit of a blur, but also a new lens on the 1922 version that feels evolved but also specific and a take.
Avishai has a way of making me excited for movies that I don't want to watch, so.
There's some stuff you're going to be really into in this, and I think there's some stuff that's going to turn you off.
Yeah, well, I'm excited. So that will be our next adventure. Okay, so thank you to Jamie Blumberg, our incredible editor. You can follow them online, I believe, on Mastodon, and their website is jamberg.me. And I don't know, do we do social media anymore? I don't know.
You can find me on Instagram at Avishai Oddity. That's AVISHAIODDITY. For now, I'm on Blue Sky. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I'm Ink as Rain, INKASRAIN on both of those places as well. But kind of vampire-like. There's less and less satisfaction in returning to these sources.
The sunlight is painful.
Yes, exactly. And we're gonna leave you guys on our favorite lines of the movie. So why don't you go first?
I'm just gonna recommend one for you.
Okay.
Because there's an accent for this.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I think I'll do this one. There are far worse things awaiting a man than death.
They're all crazy. They're all crazy except you and me. Sometimes I have my doubts about you.
See you next time.
Bye.